Hello and welcome back to AP Human Geography. Today we're going to be talking about spatial interaction and spatial behaviors, and this is the foundation kind of basic information that we're going to need in order to talk about trade and trade routes and cultural exchange and things like that. So in this case what we're going to talk about are some very general concepts, and then we'll move on later to some more specific ideas. Okay, so first of all, when we talk about spatial interaction, it's really simply the movement of something between or within an area, and you can really kind of break this up into four general categories, and that's international trade, intranational trade, telecommunications, and electronic information. And the information one, you can just have information in general, and that's totally fine. But whatever you're talking about, it's got to be something that is going to go someplace else. That's pretty much it. Okay, so which of the following would not be an example of a spatial interaction, or as it's also known, commodity flow? Well, in the case of two Bronze Age tribes meeting and you're discussing ways of making jewelry, you're sharing information. Okay? When you build the Panama Canal, you are connecting two bodies of water and shortening a trade route, making trade easier. Okay? When you're an Amazon Prime member, you're receiving goods from some other location. But if you're just an astronaut, and I don't mean just an astronaut because astronauts are awesome, but you're just repairing this orbiting structure, then you're not really exchanging anything with anybody else. Spatial interaction is just that, it's an interaction. So, alright, now, when we look at the bases of interaction, there are really three things that you want to talk about. And that's complementarity, transferability, and intervening opportunity. And we're going to talk about those in just a second, but it all boils down to this, that resources are not evenly distributed. Products are not evenly distributed, and so you do want to make these exchanges, but you have to think about transportation, the connections between places, and the costs of all of these things. And so it's not just about the goods themselves, it's going to be about all the things that go with moving those goods. Alright, so complementarity is where you have this relationship where one group wants something else and they can get it. Right? Now, just having something that's different is not enough to initiate some sort of exchange, because there has to be a desire to have that product and an ability to transfer it, right? Which is, we'll talk about in a second. But here's a really good example. Brazil and Greenland have completely different resources, but they don't really have anything that the other group wants or needs, and so you're not going to have this exchange, okay? And so when you start looking at these patterns of complementarity around the world, raw materials, you've got this raw material idea, you've also got food, and then you've got the actual products. And so you're going to have kind of these bases of complementarity, is that you're going to look at the raw goods to the production facilities and the production facilities to the consumer. Okay? Oil is a really, really good example of complementarity because lots of people want it and it's in very limited places. And so when you start looking at that exchange, you can see that you have large exchanges over large distances, but then you still have these smaller exchanges, but you can see it going everywhere. Okay, now the second part is transferability. Just because you want something somebody else has doesn't necessarily mean that you can get it there. And so if you look at the basic definition of transferability, it's the cost of exchange, those costs being acceptable, okay? And it's not just about cost, it's also about time, and that's very important too, okay? And there are really three conditions that have to be met. First of all, the value of the product has to be worth whatever the time and money is to get it. Okay, and that's the basic concept. And those are these three things I have listed here. But in a nutshell, that's what you're saying. Okay, so which of the following is an example of transferability? Thomas Jefferson commissions the search for the Northwest Passage. You camp out overnight for tickets to Vampires vs. Zombies 2. You debate between regular ground or overnight shipping. Well, in this case, right, C is going to be the answer, because even though there's desire or there's initiation of contact and all of these others, when you're debating between regular ground shipping and overnight shipping, what you're doing is you're trying to set the conditions of the transfer of that item. You've already met the complementarity point, and now you're just trying to figure out how much you want to spend to get it to you. How much is it worth to you? Okay, so basically, if you exceed, right, if time and money exceeds the desire for the object, there's no exchange. Okay, and so if you don't have that exchange, the buyer is really going to either say, I just don't need that, or they're going to find something else. Okay, and it's not constant. It really depends. If you find, like Panama Canal, for instance, that we were talking about earlier, is a really good example. With the Panama Canal, that made goods easier to get, right, and cheaper to get in a lot of cases. And so you have this increase in transferability. But let's say that you have a blockage of a river, right? Let's say that there's a dam, right? Beavers go out and build a dam and block off your river. Well, and you have to go overland travel. Well, that's not going to work out very well. Or more realistically, let's say that your river dries up, right? And now you've got this land travel. Well, a lot of those goods that were coming down the river, which are fairly easy to transport, are not going to be coming down the river. They're going to be overland. It's more expensive. It takes more time. People might stop buying those if they're not worth it. Okay? Now, intervening opportunity is the third thing. Okay? And that means that you're going to buy from the nearest source, right? You're not going to buy, and this is my example, if you live in New York, you're not going to buy sand from the Sahara Desert because there's sand very close to you, and it's obviously cheaper. So this is kind of that idea of buying local. In most cases, if you have the choice of the same product, you're going to get it from the local distributor. All right, now, I just want to remind you about friction of distance. We've talked about this before, but these ideas of complementarity, transferability, and intervening opportunity play into this larger concept of friction of distance, right? And if you have something that's farther away, it's got to be worth more because of that friction of distance, right? And so you're going to see distance decay, which we've also talked about, in terms of the time and the money for transferring your object to you, okay? And friction of distance is reduced by lower costs and ease of flow. And that means that distance decay also decreases, and so you get this larger area of interaction. Okay, so which of the following involves friction of distance? Okay, in this case, it's going to be A and C. And this is really important. Putting a man on the moon wouldn't be friction of distance, even though it was a very difficult thing to do, because you're not having a consistent exchange. But when you talk about America being governed from overseas, you have very slow communications. The people in the colonies are not getting the same resources that the people in London are getting. They don't have representation in the government. And so you have this decay of interaction because of that friction. And then the Transcontinental Railroad absolutely connected the country, right? The two sides of the country. But by the same token, you still have this long distance that you've got to go. And so what ended up happening was you'd have the governing body in Washington, D.C. making decisions for places that were very far away that didn't have any sort of interaction. And that played into some of the interesting borders and historical events out in the American West that might not have happened if there was a reduced distance or a reduced distance decay. Okay, now we want to talk a little bit about the gravity concept, and we've talked about this before when we were talking about central place, and this is the same idea. So we're going to take that central place idea that we were talking about before, and we're going to apply it to trade, okay? And one of the big key phrases that you want to think about is the expectation of opportunity. larger cities are going to have more opportunities, and you expect more from larger cities. And so, much like Newton's law of universal gravitation, you can kind of apply that general idea to big things attract more, right? And so exchanges will increase with the opportunity, right? The expectation of opportunity in the larger cities. Okay, so which of the following is going to illustrate the gravity concept best? London begins as the Roman outpost Londinium. You visit a cousin in Manhattan. Mount Rushmore is a popular tourist attraction, or none of the above. Well, it turns out that the gravity concept is going to apply to this idea of Londinium. And the reason that London is what it is today is because it started out as this small little outpost, but it was connected to these larger places, and so it was a center of goods for this area. And as it got more goods and more people, more goods and more people, more goods and more people, it becomes this cascade effect until you have London that you have today. If you're visiting a cousin in Manhattan, you might be overcoming friction of distance to go see that person, but you're not being attracted to that. That's simply a familial relationship, a kinship issue, okay? And then Mount Rushmore is not a gravity concept because it's a tourist attraction. People are going to see it, but they're not going to have this opportunity. They're not going there to work. They're not going there to live. And that's what we're really talking about when we talk about the gravity concept. Okay, now interaction potential. When you start looking at the distance decay models and the gravity concept, you're dealing with two places. In reality, there are lots of regions that are interacting with each other. And so what you do see is that you have cities that begin to specialize, because if it's just two places interacting, you're going to have a lot of different industries going on. But if you have lots of different cities, they're going to need some way to pull in more people, to pull in more business. And that's how we get those specialized cities that we talked about when we were talking about basic sector jobs and things like that. Because when you have specialized cities, you get this collective complementarity. And so you'll have multiple interactions, and individuals will go to multiple places to get goods, and so there are multiple cities that are supported. Now, you also want to talk about the potential model, and this is going to talk about the interaction opportunities, right, when you have a multi-centered network. And basically what it's going to show is the relative position, right, of each of these specialized areas in relation to all of the other areas. And there are four things that are going to be very important in this. One is marketing, right? Because if nobody knows you have something, they're not going to buy it, right? Land values depends on how much everything is and how much your product is and how many people are buying it. Broadcasting is how far out, right, you're talking about getting, and how many people need it, right? And then commuting patterns is where are people going? There are biases of travel. And so if you are not in one of those travel patterns, then you're probably not going to have very much success. And that brings us, of course, to the idea of movement biases, right? When you have a flow develop, it tends to stay that way, and you can look at chain migration, all of those things, that you'll have these trade routes, for instance. They're the same. People go the same, and you go where other people have been before. And so you have a shopping center, right, that attracts people, okay? And so more merchants will open up shops along the routes that people go to this shopping center, and then even more people go there, and so you get this larger flow. But if you're not building your shop on one of those main sectors of flow, then you're probably not going to be successful again. Right, and that is a movement bias, and then direction bias is part of that. First of all, the movement bias is actually this idea of people referring to preferring short trips to long trips, but you end up having these restricted flows, and people don't go everywhere. And a really good example of that is when you look at trucking, it goes along an east-west axis, even though there are several points, and like in the middle of the country, for instance, where you could shift to a north-south. But mostly you're going to see your north-south on the coast, and then it'll go east-west across the central part of the country. So what that sets up with these direction flows is what's called a network bias, okay? And so you have these channels of spatial interaction, and trade routes are a very good example of that. And so this is just a network. And it's also not limited to goods, but it includes information. Think the internet. That's kind of why it's called that. Okay, so as a result of network bias, which of these is true? You're more likely to drive a car than take a train. A shop owner pays higher rent for a location on I-75. You prefer writing letters to sending emails, or you watch one TV station more than another. In this case, it's going to be the shop owner paying higher rent is a network bias, because they could be anywhere, but they're going to be on the network, okay? In those direction bias routes. Okay, and so when you put all of this together, you can look at the idea of the individual activity space. And so you can map everywhere everybody goes and come up with this territory that everybody has. Everybody has their own home range or territory. And it's based on three things. What you're doing, right? So if you are a high school student, your individual activity space is going to be very, very different than someone who's retired, because you're doing different things, okay? You also want to know what you have accessible. If you are 10 years old and have a bicycle, then your mobility is limited by that as compared to somebody who has a car, or if you're relying on public transportation or whatever. So means of mobility is important. And then also, what do you need to do, and what is open to you to do, right, on a daily basis. And that's what's going to determine home range. And of course, you can apply all of those to larger concepts, right? And again, you can apply all of this to trade routes and stuff like that. But it's not just about space, it's about time. And a really good example of that is that you might drive farther to go someplace because it's on a highway, and because it's on a highway, it takes less time to get there, even though you're going farther. And so what you're looking at there is the tyranny of time. Distance is a very important component, but time is probably even a more important component, because that's the one thing that is going to be the big limiting factor. And so when you talk about distance and you talk about time, right, the constraints that those make is called the space-time prism. And everything that you do has to operate within the space-time prism. And the critical distance is the extent, right, the boundary of your space-time prism. Okay, so if anybody has any questions, or if you have any questions, please let me know at the beginning of class next time, and we will be applying these concepts to global trade. Thanks for listening.